Welcome to World History and the West. The topic for this week is the Great War. As we progress through the material of the week, keep in mind the following central question. Was the Great War the final conflict between the new progressive Europe and the remnants of absolutist Europe? The foundations of the war. The foundations of the Great War were laid well in advance. The 19th century started with conflict between liberalism and conservatism. Following the revolutions of 1848, nationalism grew across Europe, feeding the unifications of Italy and Germany. In addition, a different version of imperialism, New Imperialism, focused on Africa, creating tensions in Europe. European nations soon developed strategic alliances that would come into play in 1914. In addition, communism also entered the picture, although not a cause of World War I. By 1917, liberalism, conservatism, nationalism, and communism would become the big four ideologies. This would lead up to World War II, when fascism joined the ideological picture. Lecture context. Where? Europe and beyond. When? 1914 to 1918. Lecture topics. Moving towards war. Eastern and Western fronts. A world war. And the lasting impact. The central question of the week. Was the Great War the final conflict between the new progressive Europe and the remnants of absolutist Europe? The broader picture. The Great War was preceded by the Victorian era and post-Napoleonic Europe. Both new imperialism and industrialization were factors in the build-up to the war. Each of these developments also occurred during the modern era. Imperialism. This is the policy of extending a nation's power or influence through the acquisition of colonies. Imperialism is really nothing new. We've talked about it much throughout the course. However, imperialism just prior to the First World War would take on a slightly new meaning than the version that existed in previous centuries. Industrialization drove the need for more natural resources, which Africa had much of. Old and New Imperialism. Old imperialism. This existed for centuries prior to the mid-1800s. Prospective colonies would be explored and claimed by European powers. Europeans would then move to the new colonies to help them grow, especially in the case of the Americas, less so with Asian colonies. God, glory, and gold was the motivation for old imperialism. New imperialism occurred from 1871 to 1914. And was heavily based upon capitalist ideals and industrialization. Britain was the first to industrialize among the great European powers. Other nations competing with Britain, especially the new Germany, were now motivated to industrialize and colonize vast regions of Africa in the quest for valuable natural resources. White man's burden was the concept that believed so-called superior Europeans were obligated to help lesser people groups through colonization. In addition, new imperialism involved political and economic control of the colony, nationalism, and little transfer of European population. Attempts at diplomacy. Following the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, a unified Germany emerged and became the most dominant force on continental Europe. In 1878, a conference was held in Berlin to balance the power in Europe. The conference addressed boundary lines in Eastern Europe following the Russo-Turkish War of 1877–1878. The Ottoman Empire was a declining power at this time. Over the decades, new independent states would form in the Balkan region previously controlled by the Ottomans. Representatives also discussed the Congress system, also known as the Concert of Europe, and this focused mainly on preserving peace and security among the great powers of Europe. The Berlin Conference. In 1885, a conference was held in Berlin to set guidelines for European colonization in Africa. The scramble for Africa, as it became known, had created tension and competition amongst the European nations. At the conference, it was agreed that a nation who possessed territory on the coast had the right to expand to the interior. European nations had to notify others officially of their acquisitions. The German First Minister Otto von Bismarck led the conference. Germany would gain several African colonies as it attempted to play catch-up to the British in world power. The Scramble for Africa, 1885 to 1914. Analyze the map and consider the following questions. Which European nations were the most dominant in Africa? And what larger movement drove the desire for colonies? Changes to the Congress system. Typically, the power of the Congress system was shared amongst the nations of Europe. However, Bismarck felt that Germany should take a leading role within the system to ensure peace and the protection of their own interests. He also had other objectives: to control Russia in the east, keep France isolated, prevent war between Italy and Austria-Hungary, avoid interference in the affairs of Britain, and secure an alliance with Austria-Hungary. Bismarck was very practical in his foreign policy, but not ruthless or Machiavellian. For example, he recognized that if he allowed Britain to control the seas, Britain would allow Germany to be the dominant power on continental Europe. 1871 to 1890. Events that transpired following the Conference of 1878 included: Germany signs the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary in 1879. In 1882, this would become the Triple Alliance with the inclusion of Italy. Of course, this would be one of the main alliances of the First World War. The Three Emperors League was a non-aggression pact between Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. France was now isolated and very vulnerable. Britain's interests were left alone by Germany. The rise of Kaiser Wilhelm II. In 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm II ascended the German throne. His first order of business was to demand the resignation of Otto von Bismarck. Wilhelm wanted to take over the role of foreign affairs for himself. He was less diplomatic and more aggressive in his dealings with other countries. This created greater fear and suspicion among the countries of Europe. Wilhelm's first moves. After Bismarck resigned, Wilhelm cancelled the treaty with Russia and initiated a huge buildup of the German navy, which angered the British, who had the strongest navy in the world. An arms race between the two countries would ensue. The response of other countries. Russia and France signed the treaty in 1894. Britain greatly expanded their navy. Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale in 1904. Britain, France, and Russia signed the Triple Entente in 1907. This alliance would be the alliance that opposed the Triple Alliance during World War I. Conflict in the Balkans. In 1908, Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia. This angered many Serbs in the region, which would later culminate with the assassination of the Archduke. In 1912, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro pushed the Ottomans out of Europe. In 1913, disputes arose between the Eastern European countries over the new boundaries. There were many ethnic rivalries in the region that came to the surface as a result of the new power vacuum. The assassination of the Archduke. In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia visited Sarajevo, Bosnia. They were on a goodwill mission to improve relations with the newly annexed Bosnia. He was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and he was assassinated on June 28, 1914 by Gavrilo Princip of the Black Hand. The Black Hand was a terrorist group that desired to free Serbs living under Austro-Hungarian rule. The Alliances of Europe, 1914. The two major alliances were the Triple Alliance, or Central Powers, and the Triple Entente. Take a moment to analyze the map and consider the most significant challenges faced by each of the main alliances. The final steps to war. Following the assassination of the Archduke, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia and France then mobilize. Germany orders France and Russia to halt mobilization. They both refuse. Germany declares war on Russia, then France. Germany invades Belgium using the Schlieffen Plan. Britain declares war on Germany. Germany's invasion of Belgium ultimately drew Britain into the war. Britain had agreed to protect Belgian neutrality since the creation of Belgium in the 1830s. War in Europe. The Germans hoped that by executing the Schlieffen Plan, they could surprise France and quickly defeat her. They could then focus on defeating Russia in the east. However, their plan failed to materialize as they had hoped, and they ended up fighting a war on two fronts, the Eastern and Western fronts. The Western Front. The Western Front would be the main theater of the war. Trench warfare would come to define the way in which the war was fought. The machine guns and massive artillery of the war necessitated the need to dig in and seek cover. These trench lines would extend from the Swiss border all the way to the English Channel. This theater was mostly a stalemate until 1918. Some of the famous battles include Ypres, the Somme, Verdun, the Marne, and also the 100 Days. The Eastern Front. In comparison to the Western Front, the Eastern Front experienced much more movement over a vast region of geographical and ethnic diversity. The Battle of Tannenberg would be a significant victory in the East for the Germans. In addition, the fall of the Russian monarchy and the rise of Lenin would alter the outcome of the war. The new communist government in Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1917, removing themselves from the war. This would allow the Germans to transfer mass amounts of troops to the Western Front by early 1918. The War in Africa. European colonies in Africa immediately drew the continent into the war. In West Africa, the German colony of Togo surrendered quickly while the fighting in Cameroon continued until 1916. In Southwest Africa, South African forces, without the aid of the British, invaded German Southwest Africa, also known as Namibia, defeating them and occupying that land. In Southwest Africa, the Germans were aided by the Boers, Dutch settlers who had previously fought the British during the Boer War. The War in Africa. In East Africa, the fighting was the fiercest. Fighting took place on land and water. The terrain in this area was quite different from other parts of Africa. Disease would also affect the troops on both sides. In the end, the British and Belgian forces were unable to suppress German resistance, and the Germans only surrendered following the armistice of 1918. The War in the Middle East. In November of 1914, the Ottomans joined the war on the side of the Germans. A few key battles took place. The Suez Canal was a key transportation route that both sides desired to control. The Battle of Gallipoli took place in 1915 and saw an attempt by the British to attack the Ottomans through the Dardanelles. This battle was a major failure for the British and cost over 200,000 lives. The head of the Navy, Winston Churchill, would be forced to resign. Arab uprisings led by Lawrence of Arabia. The British encouraged Arab tribes to work with them to overthrow the Ottomans with the promise of independence following the war. In the end, the Ottomans were defeated and their empire was disintegrated by 1918. The New Europe. The guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th month of the 11th day. Over the next year, the Treaty of Versailles would determine the fate of Germany and also restructure Europe. Dominated by the Big Four, the terms of the treaty would usher in a new era in European history. What are the big changes to the map illustrated? The Treaty of Versailles. The Big Four at the treaty each had differing interests and objectives. France sought to punish Germany. They had been invaded in both 1870 and 1914 and wanted to make sure that Germany never rose again. Britain wanted to ensure they would remain dominant in the world. The Americans sought a balanced peace under President Woodrow Wilson. Italy would leave the treaty disappointed, and fascists would take over the government in 1922. In the end, the terms of the treaty would greatly cripple Germany and lay the groundwork for Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s. Some conclusions. Over 15 million would lose their lives in the Great War, and millions had their lives greatly altered by the damages of the war. It was believed that the war to end all wars would bring about an era of peace. Yet within 20 years, a war of even greater consequence would come to both Europe and the world.